I'm Richard Reeves. My day job is as a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, but my qualifications for having written about boys and men also include having raised 3 boys to adulthood. I have 3 sons who are now 26, 22, and 20. And so, yeah, so they're all, I don't have any teenagers left.
Okay.
Just,
You're like, I have
that was a big hurdle. I'm done.
Yes, you're done.
Of course, one's never done, but,
never done.
but
Yes.
past that bit of it anyway.
Okay, so you have a personal investment in writing about this. I read somewhere that you were not sure about writing about this, that you had some trepidation. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, because of the way that these discussions are framed in a zero-sum way, it's like you can care about A or B, but not A and B, and so you can either think that we should really worry about what's happening in boys and men, or you can focus on the challenges of women and girls, but you can't do both. And currently in the political environment in particular, I think right now there's really a digging in on both sides of that divide. And so merely to raise the fact that there are reasons to be worried now about boys and men is to run the risk of appearing to be saying, so we don't need to worry about women and girls anymore, or even at worst, to be cast as somebody who's against the feminist movement or the women's movement and so on, because of it's zero sum. Like, are you on whose side are you on? One of my biggest hopes, frankly, for writing the book was to help create a little bit more space for a conversation about this between people of good faith, agreeing or disagreeing. Because if we don't have the conversation, then it's going to it's not like the conversation is not going to happen. It's just a question of what kind of conversation. Let's just preface this whole conversation on average,
Okay,
right?
okay,
Distributions overlap, because otherwise, you know, it just gets boring to say it every time. But also you're in fear that if you don't say it every time, someone will take that one bit and say, how absurd. He doesn't appear to know that these are just average differences. Okay, no, I do know.
You're like, I know they're average.
I know that. I know the distributions overlap. The more interesting question is how much the distributions overlap, how big the average differences are, and what, if anything, it means for the way we conduct ourselves, like individually and socially. And the answer to that is going to differ according to the differences. But you start by saying there are some traits, innate preferences, traits, which are influenced by our biology, that are more strongly associated with being male, right? So the 3 I particularly focus on are a greater potential for aggression and aggressive behavior, more tendency to take appetite for risk. So there are positive and negative ways to frame all of these things. So I'm trying to frame them neutrally at the moment. And then having a much more driven sexuality, so being more driven by sex. And so that you have these tendencies that you're going to have with you, and also a slight tendency to be a bit more into things than people. So a little bit less relational, a bit more into things. You're going to, on average, you're more likely to have those traits if you're a boy, and then into a man. And so the question then is, how do you learn how to express and not express those tendencies? When is it appropriate? How do you modulate them? How do you learn to express them? When is it good to express them, and when is it not good to express them?
I hear you talking a lot about kind of learning what's appropriate and not appropriate, and regulating your emotions and desires. Like I tell my kids all the time, every feeling is natural and normal, not all behavior is, right? So that's kind of what you're saying, which is great.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. So I come at this from different angles. As a scholar, what I'm seeing is a lot of trends that really concern me in a number of fields. But you know, we probably spend more time talking about education, which is great, but also employment and fatherhood, which that loops back probably to the family as well.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's good evidence that a lot of boys are really struggling in school now. And that's relative to girls who've blown way past them. I mean, girls are just smoking the boys in the classroom at every level now, just every level. And that then can translate into difficulties in getting into the workplace and so on too. But it's not just that they're relatively struggling compared to girls, it's that they're just actually struggling. It's not just that they're not doing great, not all doing great, but the girls are doing even greater. in many cases is really, really struggling. Much lower rates of high school graduation than girls do. And you really see it playing out in college, actually. College is a good proxy because, of course, college is that bridge between school and work for a lot of people. And there's a bigger gender gap in college going now, and getting college degrees now in favor of women than there was in favor of men 50 years ago when Title IX was passed. So the gender inequality is just as wide. It's just flipped. High school GPA, top 10%, 2/3 girls, bottom 10%, 2/3 boys. 1 in 4 Black boys are held back a year. In the average school district in the US now, girls are almost a grade level ahead in English and have caught up in math. So there's no gap in math anymore. And so just across the board, what you see is just this kind of strong outperformance, and in some cases declining performance for boys. And then that translates into some of the difficulties we see in the labor market and employment. It's, I think, a salient economic fact is that most American men earn less today than most American men did in 1979.
Wow.
So that's like, if that's in 4 decades actually gone backwards. Men at the top are doing better, but median man has gone down, whereas the median woman is 30% wage gain, and wage gains across the board. Now, it doesn't mean we've closed the gender pay gap, but the lines are going very, very sharply in different directions. And so when you have a group of people who are actually economically worse off than they were 40 years ago, then there's reason to be worried.
So what do you think is what do you look at as the source for this shifting? Because one of the things that I thought was interesting is when you look at support programming for girls, there's so much future is female, girls in STEM, girls in this, girls in that, girls in sports. Like, it's amazing and it should exist. And I'm so happy it exists, but there really isn't that much for boys. And so I'm just wondering, that's just from my perspective as a mom looking up programs for young boys, but I'm curious from your research and what you've done, what you think is the source of this problem, this trend.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the education system is structured slightly in favor of girls and women, partly because they develop a little bit earlier, so their brains just develop sooner, partly because girls hit puberty earlier than boys, and so particularly in adolescence, they develop the prefrontal cortex, which I think you talked about before.
Right, yeah.
It's the bit of your brain that makes you do your chemistry homework rather than going out to party. It's the bit of your brain that worries about your GPA. It's the bit of your brain that actually turns your homework in, and that kind of stuff. And that bit of the brain just develops about a year or 2 earlier in girls than in boys. And so in adolescence, in particular, 15 and 16, those years, there's quite a big difference in the average development of girls and boys. And so just biologically, I think girls are an advantage. The prefrontal cortex doesn't catch up till the mid-20s for boys. And so if you have an education system that rewards that kind of behavior, paying attention, turning your homework in, looking to the future, being organized, having a degree of self-discipline, then inevitably girls are going to do better in that education system. So then the obvious question is, well, why didn't we see it before then? Well, we kind of did. Girls were doing better in high school in the 60s, a little bit, which made no sense whatsoever because none of them were going to college.
Right, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So obviously the gap has gotten bigger, but the intrinsic structural advantages that girls had in education just weren't visible until we actually took the brakes off their opportunities and aspirations. And so once we took the brakes off, particularly in the 70s, the girls just flew. And it's now become apparent that they do have these structural advantages, which is why they blew right past. So nobody worried about what would happen if not only that girls and women caught up with boys and men, but that they would blow right past them and keep going. No one predicted that, and so no one planned for it. And so I think the answer to your question really is that we haven't updated our view of the world quickly enough, because it's happened quite quickly in a matter of decades. And so you've got all these institutions and honestly a mindset which is about gender inequality means girls and women,
right?
And we need to empower girls and women in education. And so and that was true 40, 50 years ago, but it's not true now. Or at least I would say it's equally important to send messages of empowerment to boys and girls. In fact, now it's even more important. So when I remember I was actually walking along the school corridor with one of my kids, and on one of these back to school nights or something, and the wall was plastered with female scholarships for STEM, a female-only college enrollment night, a girls on the run thing for girls, girls into, women into STEM, and he and I were just kind of looking at all this, and he's like, yeah, but the thing is that the girls from my school, twice as many go to selective colleges as the boys, twice as many doing AP as the boys. They're just smoking us, right? And so he's looking at this wall of all stuff, and he said he tried to talk to one of his female friends about it, and she said, you don't get it. And he said, I don't get what? And she said, you don't get patriarchy. And he's like, well, I think I do. I just need someone to explain to me, like, why is there nothing here for me when I'm struggling so much at school? And so we have to recalibrate those messages of empowerment, because we're in real danger now of not only not sending empowering messages to boys, but sending disempowering ones to them.
The thing that just occurred to me when you were talking was it's almost a punishment. Like, I don't know that that's conscious, but it's kind of like, you've benefited for so long.
Yeah.
You have had this privilege for so long. Fuck off. Right. So again, like, it's not an active conscious punishment, because who would do that to a child? But that feeling of, you've benefited for so long, you're going to be fine. Right. Like, kind of like, you're going to be fine.
Yes. Just by definition. So the default is boys and men are going to be fine because we're in a patriarchal, sexist society, so they don't need any extra help. Right. And changing that default when we're now in a world where a lot of boys are really struggling is just incredibly difficult. But I think emotionally, Kimmy, you're exactly right. There is this sense of, like, we've had 10,000 years of patriarchy. We've had, like, just a few minutes where women and girls are ahead of men, and already you're panicking about that? Like, seriously? Like, so can we just have like 5 minutes? But honestly, and I get that. I totally get it. I think at an emotional level, I totally get that reaction. I think viscerally, a lot of women are like, it's just hard to just go, okay, I get it, because it's been such a long fight.
Yes.
And so these gains are so recent and so hard won. So I get it. But when you look at the data, when you look at the trends, and you look at who's suffering now, what are we going to do? Do we need 10,000 years where boys are at a disadvantage, and then we can call it even? Then we can call it quits? Or do we actually want equality? Do we actually want equity? Do we actually want everybody to flourish? Isn't that what the women's movement was actually about? And of course, nobody wants to say, okay, we have to have 10,000 years the other way around before we're going to be satisfied. No one really thinks that, but at an emotional level, it's hard, especially when it's just happened so fast. I mean, it's the blink of an eye. And of course, we create all these institutions and cultures. I mean, there's the Coalition for Women and Girls in Education. There's like Title IX officers. There's just like a whole bunch of, there's a Association for American University Women. There's, I could keep going. There's a lot of institutions whose job it is to worry about girls and women in education. And they do a pretty damn good job of it, honestly. And thank God for them. There are none for boys and men, because we didn't need any, or so we thought. Now we desperately do. And so there's this huge vacuum. We don't have programming, we don't have advocacy, we don't have empowering messages for boys. And in fact, the very idea of having an empowering message for boys rubs some people the wrong way, because they'll say, well, they have all the power. Well, not according to the charts I'm looking at, they don't.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is that I just feel like they need to be empowered. They need to feel like they're not wrong. The messaging can't be you're bad, right? You're inherently bad. So you should feel ashamed. So I'm totally with you on that. What are some of your concrete solutions? Because that's what your book of Boys and Men is being lauded for, this idea of that it's not just cultural criticism, but that you have some real suggestions for how this shift can change. And it dovetails so beautifully into your other book and your other work about really trying to strengthen the middle class, because we're talking about these extremes happening, right? Where there isn't as much of everyone flourishing. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the solution part of it.
Thank you. Yeah. And thank you for framing it that way, because that is exactly, you really captured the spirit of it, which is to try and just talk about universal flourishing broadly. Where are the problems, and also that to be solutions focused. There have been quite a few books and just general commentary on boys and men, but I would say it's been quite long on lament. and pretty short on solutions. Some of these books really are like the secular equivalent of the Book of Lamentations. And if there are solutions, they're like thrown on at the end, like with one thing, universal preaching or whatever. And it's like,
because, okay, that's my TED Talk. Good luck.
I'm done. You know, and you conclude by saying, this is an urgent task that people should address. Okay. Okay.
All hands on deck.
I was determined not to do that. I was determined to have like lots of stuff on solutions. And so, and if people disagree, that's fine. But at least we're having the conversation we're having a solutions-oriented conversation, not just stuck in the problem. Yes. Because the problems are, I think, increasingly well known, even if they're difficult to talk about. Yes. And so in terms of education, I think that there are a few things we should do. And number one, I argue that it would be a good idea to start boys in school a year later than girls. Because of that developmental difference that we talked about earlier, it does put boys at a disadvantage just developmentally. And so it's called redshirting sometimes. It's a term borrowed from athletics. Okay. We half did it with one of our kids, and I wish we'd fully done it with one of our kids, honestly. And I think it's quite possible they would all have benefited from just that extra year of maturing. And I don't mean maturing just in like a social sense. I mean like in a biological sense. Yeah, actual brain. There's no argument about the fact that there's a difference in the timing of brain development, even if there's argument about the end result. And so that's one thing we should seriously, and just be more flexible about school start generally. The second thing I'm really worried about is the declining share of male teachers. And there's some evidence that kind of male teachers are good for boys, especially in quotes non-male subjects like English. So in just the same way that it looks like for girls having STEM teachers is good for them, because those are kind of like more traditionally male subjects. Having a female teacher really helps girls, doesn't affect boys. So the opposite seems to be true in subjects like English and humanities, where there are almost no male teachers at all. Overall, K-12 teaching now is only 24% male. That's down from 33% in the 80s and dropping. Elementary schools is 1 in 10. And in early years, which I know you're very interested in early years education, which is what one of my sons works in, there's only about 3%. Yeah, it's only about 3% men. Wow. And to put that in perspective, there are between 2 and 3 times as many women flying US military planes as there are men teaching kindergarten. Wow. And I'm all for women flying military jets, don't get me wrong. We're actually redesigning the cockpits and the seats of military planes so that women can fit in them more easily than in the past. So we're redesigning planes so that women can fly them. Great.
Love it.
And we're not really redesigning the education system to attract more men and to have momentum. So I'm really worried. So I want a massive recruitment drive of male teachers, especially into subjects like English and early years, male teachers of color, especially male teachers generally, but particularly male teachers of color. I think that's just, I don't think we can just sit by and wait and watch the teaching profession go 80% female, 85% female, 90% female. Already most elementary schools don't have any male teachers. I don't think we just, the fact that we're just sitting watching that trend really, I think is irresponsible.
What do you think would help with the recruitment process, and why do you think that men are not attracted to that?
I think what would help is higher pay, which would obviously help all the women in teaching too. But I think there's some truth to the fact that men are a little bit more likely to be put off by the lower pay. So I think that's one thing. I do think we actually need some male-only scholarships into teaching, especially teaching English, etc. Just as we've had female scholarships for STEM subjects. So I think there's no reason that we can't have the mirror image of that. And we need significantly more men in teaching colleges as well. The problem is that once you get to a certain point of gender segregation in any occupation, is it gets harder to get people from the opposite gender to go in because it's seen as a women's job or a men's job. Right? That was a huge problem getting women into subjects like areas like engineering, even areas like law and so on, which now law is now 50% female, so is medicine. Engineering is 15% and rising, but still quite a long way from where we need to be. But like, if you know you're going to be the only female engineer in your class or in your company, that's a really difficult hurdle to get over. It just is. Same for men in early years, in nursing, in psychology. I mean, so I know that you're very interested in issues around mental health, so it's a slight digression, but I'm very interested in psychology, and which is used to be 50-50 male female in 1980. It's now 29% male, having dropped from 39% just in the last decade. And among psychologists under the age of 30, only 5% are male. And so so in an extraordinary short period of time, psychology has just become a female profession. And that means it's harder to get men to go into psychology because they see, boys and men see it as a female profession. And it's no wonder it's hard to get men in. It's going to get harder and harder to get men into teaching if our boys are only ever exposed to female teachers. So it becomes a vicious circle. You hit a tipping point, basically. I don't have great exact numbers on this, honestly. But my sense of having looked at it is that once you get past about 70%, it starts to get harder to recruit against it, right? Seems like that's close to like a magic number. And so if an occupation's got at least 30% of your gender in it, then that's okay, right? You're not going to feel right. But if it's 20%, 15%, it gets harder and harder. And so like the fact that teaching's at 76% now really troubles me. It's heading to 80%. And so because you do hit tipping points where you're then having to go against the grain to persuade, in this case, to persuade men that teaching is not a female profession. And I think we have to be realistic about the fact that for the foreseeable future, that isn't going to matter to people. Their gender identities are not disappearing overnight. And so it's important not to discount that as a real factor. Getting more kids doing those courses, more boys doing some of those courses, like in high school and middle school and earlier, it's hugely important. And I actually look quite hard at the success of the movement to get more women into STEM and see like what happens there. And one of the big lessons of that is you've got to get in early. And so there's been a huge number of programs, a lot of federal funding has gone into some of these programs to get, say, scientists and engineers into middle school. So female scientists and engineers into middle schools and high schools, running programs, giving talks, etc. There's some very good work from the National Girls Collaborative on this called the Million Girls Moonshot to get more than 1 million girls into STEM subjects with a lot of this outreach. And it's been pretty successful. You actually, I think, go into most middle schools now or high schools now, and you'll see a lot of activity around that. I think we've really broken the idea that STEM is only for boys. And actually, you see in undergraduate education that actually women are now getting, at least half the STEM degrees.
Right, exactly.
Not in every subject, but overall, it's been massively successful. And women now account for 27% of STEM jobs, up from 8%. Again, not 50%, but really going the right way. And actually, most scientists in the US now are women.
That's amazing. And it's amazing. And how can we do that for boys so that they not only have a broader sense of their own expression and identity, but that it also is destigmatized to go into professions that are deemed more feminine? Is there advice you'd give to parents of young boys on how to help with these really alarming trends?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I will start with a what not to do, and then I'll get to a much more positive, right? But don't use terms like toxic masculinity. Don't pathologize any of the feelings and traits that your boys are having. Don't ever use the phrase, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" Don't send a message that there's something intrinsically wrong, and that is anything to do with them being male. Don't model that in your own behavior, right? Don't women didn't fight for all the rights they've got to be able to roll their eyes at men and call them stupid. Right. That was not the goal. The goal was not to in any sense make men lesser. Just because we're making women more. The goal was to have proper equality and a proper and mutual respect. Right. What women demanded from men was respect. And there's been a huge change in that. I'm not suggesting it's completely job done, but wow, we've talked about what a different world it is. But we don't replace disrespect in one direction with disrespect in the other direction. And that leads me to the next point, which is send incredibly empowering messages to your son, especially around education and career choice. Right? Like we have you go girl, we need you go boy. We need to make sure that their sense of their identity is absolutely not against educational performance, but kind of with it. And so be empowering. Don't have the default assumption that they're going to be fine. They're not. They need the same encouragement and aspiration around their education as the girls do, at least as much, if not perhaps now a little bit more. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that school is girly or that any of that nonsense. Don't do any of that. Find opportunities for your son and your boys to make friendships across among boys, but also from different environments, including outside of schools. That's where extracurricular sports, obviously great for everybody, but particularly great for boys, honestly. But scouts, all those kinds of things, hugely important. And if you have the opportunity you have to be very subtle about this, of course, but just to help cultivate those friendships, particularly with boys, then take them. There's at least a couple of our boys' male friends who almost feel like they're part of our family. They've been on vacation with us. We kind of, when they've been in trouble, they've come to us, and so on too. And so, like, you want that. You want to be quasi parents to other boys as well. So don't just think about your own boys. Think about other boys, because that models a certain kind of behavior. But really encourage them. And then the last thing we've already kind of touched on too is if you are having conversations about gender roles, first of all, the main thing to do is model it, right? Kids believe their eyes, not their ears. Let's be clear. You can tell them stuff. It literally goes in one ear and out the other, and as it should be until they see it. So you need to model an egalitarian relationship as far as possible. You need to model what it means. If you're a guy listening to this, it's model mature masculinity along the lines we've discussed of, which is, be yourself, have male friends, like, be a guy, that's okay, but in a way that's incredibly respectful and mature and attentive. And if there are dads listening, dads matter, period. Right, whether you're breadwinning or not. I was a stay-at-home dad for quite a few years. Dads matter. We're not just walking ATMs. Your kids need you. Your sons especially need you. And so that kind of level of involvement is hugely important. And we do all that, then I think you can get to a world where we should be lifting up our boys in just the same way we lift up our girls. And that's the world we've all been fighting for, isn't it?
Yes, I'm like totally crying. Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Me too, a little bit. It's just infectious, even over Zoom. Yeah. Well, we love our boys, don't we? That's the thing. And that message of affirmation and love and respect is equally important that our boys hear it as our girls.